Well, we do want to check in with someone who has been in the room for every large financial sector combination during the credit crisis. That list includes J.P. Morgan Chase, Bear Stearns, Wells Fargo, Wachovia, PNC National City. Rodgin Cohen has been at Sulivan Cromwell for 40 years. He has been chairman there since the year 2000. We're pleased to have you with us, Raj, as always, in set, especially rainy Friday morning. Before we get to this one-year anniversary of Lehman coming up next week, I want to ask you a big change at the top at Morgan Stanley. John Mack out, James Gorman in. What do you make of that?
I just watched your interview with Bill Cohen. I thought he got it exactly right. I think John Mack did an extraordinarily masterful job in navigating through the worst financial crisis in 75 years. And although I don't know Mr. Gorman well, I do rely heavily on Greg Fleming's assessment, and Greg could not be higher on James Gorman.
So let's get to this one-year anniversary coming up next week officially of the Lehman failure. I never asked you really for your personal account, and you've had tons of high-pressure, intense moments in your career. Was this one of the top 5?
It was definitely one of the top 5 most intense, but it was also number 1 in being a disappointment, because to the very last I thought we would be able to pull it out, and it just didn't happen. Was
there ever a moment that you were fearful for the U.S. financial system?
I have to say probably every weekend, starting with the first weekend after Labor Day. We start always with Lehman, but I think the collapse of the GSEs and the conservatorship the prior weekend was an equally perilous time, and then it just seemed to be one crisis after another, weekend after weekend. And had it not been for some very decisive and resolute actions by key government officials, we could have gone over the edge of the abyss.
Raj, we only have about 40 seconds to the first break. You've been good enough to stay with us, so we'll pick up the conversation. But where do we stand now? In a word, is confidence coming back?
It definitely is. We don't want to be overconfident. We are not out of the crisis, but we are definitely on the way back.
When we come back, I actually want to talk to you about if you see the recent pickup in M&A activity that we've been seeing as a positive sign, or is it just about companies basically trying to look for ways to cut headcount? But we'll talk about that in just a minute. So we are going to be back in just a few minutes' time with more from Rodgin Cohen, chairman of Sulivan Cromwell. We are back, as promised, with Rodgin Cohen. He's been at Sulivan Cromwell for 40 years, chairman since the year 2000. Raj, before the break, we just alluded to the fact that M&A is picking up. Is this a sign of life, or is this sort of consolidations for economies of scale, in other words, ones that will eventually lead to job losses?
Well, I am regarding this increase in M&A as a positive, because M&A is so much about psychology, perhaps as much about psychology as it is finance. And people do deals when they are feeling better about themselves, when they feel good about themselves. And when you see M&A start, I think what it suggests is that people are feeling better about themselves, more comfortable about their own situation, and more comfortable about their ability to assess the target institution. Insofar as what it means for jobs, I think ultimately sound mergers create jobs, they don't destroy them. And anybody who does mergers just to slash and burn is making a real mistake, and ultimately will pay the penalty for it.
Raj, you've been watching this industry for, as we say, 40 years. Through the recessions, right, of 74, 82, the S&L crisis, the dot-com crisis, the recession, the early part of this decade, Wall Street has always come out stronger than it was going in. We've seen a crisis like we haven't seen in 70 years. Do you think Wall Street's going to be stronger after this?
At the risk of sounding like a Panglossian, I would believe that Wall Street will come out stronger. It's going to take a longer time because, as you point out, the crisis was much deeper this time. But I believe that the leaders of Wall Street understand what happened and will be able to accommodate the changes that are necessary.
How is it, though, that they'll be stronger? Because we've seen an erosion of faith, for example, in the U.S. banking system. And you have to wonder how people outside the United States feel about that, whether they're willing to trust Wall Street as much as they did before.
I think that's a very fair point. It's not going to be easy to regain the trust. But as Wall Street demonstrates that it knows better how to manage risk, to identify risk. I think the incredible engine that is U.S. capitalism will once again regain its place.
Speaking about capitalism, I just want to hit on this idea of the G20 meeting later this month. The idea of compensation limiting or changing the way bankers paid is coming up. Do you think governments understand what it's like to run a competitive enterprise? Do you think that the world of finance understands how out of proportion pay packages are for the rest of the world?
There's probably a fair amount of misunderstanding on both sides, and hopefully the answer is in between, with guidelines as to how compensation should be developed, but not hard and fast rules. It seems to me that that is the best way to go. It accommodates both the understandable anger by many at what are seen as outsized compensation packages, but what it really gets at is the risk. Compensation isn't bad so much in itself. It's when it encourages excessive risk.
Raj, very quickly, how concerned are the Wall Street CEOs, the people whose ear you have, about the fact that they've lost control of that debate in Washington?
I think there is a concern. Anybody who lived through what I call AIG Hysteria Week earlier this year has to be concerned. But again, at the risk of sounding a note of optimism, I do think the administration acted coolly and very astutely in dampening down that hysteria, and I think there is a full understanding within the administration of the dangers of being overly prescriptive and proscriptive.
Rodgin, we thank you so much for your time. Rodgin Cohen, Chairman of Sulivan and Cromwell.